She had not planned to stop there that day. It was one of those moments where life gently pushes a person toward a place they didn't expect to be. The building stood tall and elegant, with glass doors that reflected the busy street outside. Inside, everything looked polished and expensive. People moved with confidence, dressed in clothes that showed comfort and status. She hesitated at the entrance, adjusting the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder. Already feeling out of place, she was used to this feeling. For most of her life, she had learned how to stay quiet, how to take up as little space as possible. Her clothes were simple, clean but old. Her shoes had been repaired more than once. Nothing about her suggested that she belonged among people who laughed easily and spoke loudly about money. Events and connections. As she stepped inside, her eyes immediately noticed the piano. It stood near the center of the room, glossy and black, catching the light from above. It looked untouched, like a museum piece rather than an instrument meant to be played. A few people stood nearby, talking and smiling, treating it more like decoration than something alive. To them, it was just another sign of luxury. She stopped walking. For a moment, the noise around her faded. Her attention narrowed to the piano alone. Something deep inside her tightened, the way it always did when she saw one. Memories she tried not to visit pushed forward late nights. Silent practice, keys pressed carefully so no one would hear. Dreams held close because they felt too fragile to speak out loud. She hadn't touched a real piano in a long time. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if remembering shapes and movements on their own. She swallowed and looked around. No one seemed to notice her yet. People were busy with their conversations, their drinks, their laughter. She took a slow breath and walked closer. Up close, the piano looked even more intimidating. The surface reflected her face faintly, and she barely recognized herself in it. She saw someone who looked tired, someone who had been overlooked many times before. She wondered, briefly, what would happen if she just walked away. It would be easier, safer, but something stronger than fear kept her there. She stood quietly beside the bench, hands clasped together, unsure of what to do next. She didn't want attention. She didn't want trouble. She only wanted one small moment just to feel the keys under her fingers again. Even if only for a few seconds, she cleared her throat softly and turned to the nearest group. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but steady. May I touch the piano?" The words barely left her mouth before someone laughed. It wasn't cruel at first. More like surprise mixed with amusement. A few heads turned. Someone raised an eyebrow. Another person looked her up and down, not trying to hide their judgment. "Touch it?" One of them repeated, smiling as if she had made a joke. "Do you play?" Another asked, already sounding doubtful. She nodded once, slowly. "A little." That made the laughter spread. A few people exchanged looks. One person pulled out a phone, holding it casually, as if this might turn into something entertaining. To them, it felt harmless. Just a moment of fun. A break from seriousness. "Go on then," someone said, stepping aside. "Let's see." The way it was said made her chest tighten. It wasn't encouragement. It was a challenge wrapped in politeness. She felt the weight of eyes on her now, measuring her, judging her before she had done anything at all. She almost changed her mind. Her feet felt heavy as she moved toward the bench. Every step felt louder than it should have. She could feel her heart beating fast, not just from nerves, but from something deeper, years of being told she wasn't enough. Years of hiding a part of herself because it never seemed to fit anywhere. She sat down carefully. The bench was colder than she expected. She placed her hands in her lap and stared at the keys. Black and white, simple, honest. They didn't care who she was or where she came from. They never had. Still, her fingers hesitated. The room felt different now. Quieter, but not calm. It was filled with anticipation, the kind that waits for someone to fail. She could sense it in the way people leaned slightly forward, in the way whispers floated and then stopped. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. In that silence, she wasn't there anymore. She was somewhere smaller, somewhere darker, somewhere safer. A place where music had been her escape when words failed her. A place where no one clapped or laughed, where the piano was just between her and her thoughts. She opened her eyes. her right hand lifted first, hovering above the keys. It trembled slightly. Someone coughed in the background. Another person shifted impatiently. She placed her fingers down, not yet pressing. Just resting, that alone felt like a risk. People exchanged glances, clearly expecting something awkward or clumsy to happen next. Some were already smiling, ready for the moment to be over. She took one more breath, and then, very gently, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft. Almost too soft. A few people blinked, surprised that it didn't sound wrong. It wasn't loud or showy. It was careful, intentional. She pressed another key. Then another. The melody began slowly, like someone speaking after a long silence. It wasn't meant to impress. It wasn't meant to shout. It was meant to feel. Conversations stopped without anyone noticing exactly when. A laugh died halfway through. The phone that had been raised to record lowered slightly. Her shoulders relaxed as her hands started to move. The nervous shaking faded. Muscle memory took over, guiding her fingers with quiet confidence. Each note connected to the next in a way that felt natural, almost necessary. The room changed. People who had been smiling now looked confused. This wasn't what they expected. This wasn't a joke. The music carried something familiar yet hard to explain: sadness, hope, longing, strength, all woven together. She wasn't looking at anyone now. Her focus stayed on the keys, on the feeling of sound filling the space. For the first time since she had walked in, she felt like she belonged somewhere. No one interrupted. Even those who had laughed leaned closer, their expressions slowly shifting. What began as amusement turned into attention. What began as judgment turned into silence, and she kept playing, unaware that in just a few moments everything was about to change. She had just started when she felt the weight of the room's eyes. At first, it was subtle whispers, the faint shuffle of feet, someone clearing their throat nervously. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Every gaze felt like it was measuring her worth, questioning why someone like her would dare sit at a piano that clearly belonged to another world. She tried not to think about it, focusing instead on the keys beneath her fingers. But even as her hands moved with confidence, a small knot of doubt tightened in her chest. She remembered times from her past, quiet moments when people laughed at her attempts to do something beautiful. Small voices that had told her she was not enough, not talented enough, not important enough. She had learned to carry those voices quietly, like stones in her pocket, never letting anyone see the weight they added. And now, here they were, in the polished, gleaming room, ready to judge again. Some of the people around the piano were smiling at first, a smirk that said, "We know this will be funny." They leaned closer, waiting for the moment when she would falter, when her fingers would stumble, when the music would become awkward. A few even pulled out their phones to capture it, ready to share a clip of a funny moment that they thought would go viral for the wrong reason. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her, but instead of panicking, she let it sharpen her focus. Every note she played was deliberate. She thought about the countless nights she had spent practicing alone, the silent hours where the only witness to her music had been the empty walls of her small room. Those walls had never laughed. Those walls had never doubted her. And now, the piano under her hand seemed to respond the same way: calm, receptive, ready to speak her truth. Her first few notes were careful, soft, almost hesitant. They weren't flashy or impressive. They weren't meant to be. But even in their quietness, there was a kind of honesty that couldn't be ignored. It was a melody that carried fragments of her story, though no one there would have known it yet. The people around her began to notice the change. The whispers stopped, the laughter faded. They leaned in without realizing it, drawn to the sound that was so unexpectedly real, so unexpectedly moving. A woman in the corner, dressed in bright clothes and bold jewelry, crossed her arms and frowned. She had been confident moments ago, thinking she knew what would happen. Now, her frown was mixed with curiosity. She tilted her head, listening, trying to figure out how someone so ordinary in appearance could produce something so extraordinary. Her phone was forgotten on the table beside her. The laughter had vanished completely. Other people in the room were doing the same. A man who had been smirking from the start now shifted uneasily. He had expected awkward mistakes, something to mock or joke about. Instead, he was confronted with music that seemed to carry weight, emotion, and depth. The subtlety of her playing made him uneasy. There was a story behind it, a quiet strength that he hadn't anticipated. She continued, her fingers moving over the keys almost automatically now. The nervous tension in her body eased slightly as she let the music flow. Her eyes stayed on the piano, but she could sense the shift happening around her. The room, once filled with light laughter and casual chatter, was now silent except for the sound of her playing. Every note felt like a message she couldn't say out loud. It was a message that told of struggles, of moments of doubt, and of the determination to rise above them. A few of the people who had laughed at her before now exchanged looks. Confusion and disbelief were written across their faces. One of them whispered to another, but the words were low, almost inaudible, as if even speaking might break the spell. They couldn't make sense of what was happening. How could someone they had dismissed so easily, someone who seemed ordinary, play with such skill and emotion? It was unexpected. It was impossible to predict. She didn't notice the change in the room at first. She was lost in the music, in the way each key spoke to her, in the rhythm that had been ingrained in her hands through years of practice. Memories from her past floated through her mind, times she had played alone, times she had feared people's reactions, times she had believed no one would ever understand. And yet here she was, her music filling a space full of people who had not expected to hear anything meaningful at all. Few people shifted nervously in their seats. One man's jaw tightened, and he leaned back slightly, arms crossed, as if to protect himself from the realization that he had misjudged her. Another person covered their mouth, their eyes wide, trying not to show surprise. The atmosphere had changed completely. The room that had once been filled with laughter and doubt was now filled with awe and silence. She felt the music inside her growing stronger, more confident. The quiet judgment in the room had turned into focused attention, and even though she had not wanted it at first, it gave her energy. She played as though each note was a conversation, each chord a statement. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but she couldn't help the power of her own story coming through. It was as if every moment of doubt, every night spent alone practicing, every harsh word she had ever heard had been stored in her fingertips. And now it had a voice. Someone in the back tried to move closer, and she could hear the soft shuffle of their steps. Others leaned in without realizing it, drawn to the unexpected truth in her music. They had come expecting a joke, a moment of amusement, and instead they were faced with something real. Something genuine? Something human. Even as she played, she felt a strange mixture of emotions herself. There was relief for finally expressing what had been hidden. There was fear for knowing that the attention was now on her, and any mistake could shatter the fragile respect that had begun to form. And yet, above it all, there was joy. The kind of joy that comes from doing what you were meant to do, from finally letting your talent speak without apology or fear. Time seemed to stretch. A few people checked their watches, probably expecting her to stop soon. But she didn't. She played on, allowing the melody to grow richer, more layered. Every movement of her fingers carried intention. Every note had meaning. The room was no longer just a gathering of people. It had become a witness to her life, her struggles, her determination. By the end of the piece, something remarkable had happened. The people who had laughed at her before were no longer laughing. They weren't even whispering. They were silent, watching, feeling, realizing. They had been ready to judge, but now they were learning something far more important, that talent cannot be measured by appearances, and that judging too quickly can blind people to what truly matters. She lifted her hands from the keys and exhaled softly, almost as if she was waking from a dream. The sound lingered in the room, echoing quietly off the walls. For the first time, she allowed herself to look up. And what she saw made her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the unexpected respect in their eyes. Faces that had been filled with doubt were now open, honest, and attentive. People were seeing her, really seeing her in a way they never had before. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The music had said everything she wanted to say. And as she sat there, quiet and humble, she realized something powerful, the moment she had feared. The moment that had seemed impossible had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone in that room. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly from the effort and the adrenaline. But inside she felt calm. She had faced their doubt and their judgment, and she had done what she had come to do. She had reminded herself of her worth, and now she had reminded everyone else as well. In that moment, she understood something she had always known quietly, deep inside. True talent speaks for itself. And sometimes it needs only a single chance to be heard. She had finished the first part of the melody, but she didn't stop. The quiet that had fallen over the room was something she had never expected. At first it had been laughter and doubt, then curiosity, and now complete silence. Every person was watching her with wide eyes, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Some looked shocked, others confused, and a few even had their mouths slightly open. They had come expecting entertainment at someone else's expense, but instead, they were witnessing something they hadn't anticipated. Her fingers moved over the keys again, but this time the melody was different. It was stronger, richer, and carried more emotion than before. Each note seemed to tell a story, and even without words it spoke to everyone in the room. People shifted in their seats, leaning in without realizing it. The woman in bright clothes who had been frowning now had her hands folded in front of her, eyes focused and unblinking. The man in the back who had been smirking earlier was gripping the edge of the table, his expression tense and unsure. Everyone was silent because the music demanded attention. As she played, she thought about the countless nights she had spent alone, practicing quietly when no one was around. She remembered the small apartment she had once lived in, where the piano had been old and out of tune, but it didn't matter. It was hers. She had spent hours perfecting each note, learning to express herself through sound rather than words. And now, here she was, in a room full of strangers who had expected her to fail, playing a piece that carried everything she had felt, every struggle and every moment of hope. The melody grew softer for a moment, almost whispering, delicate and fragile. It made people in the room lean closer, listening more carefully. The subtlety of it was what drew them in. It was not loud or flashy, but it was honest. It reminded them of things they had forgotten, things like quiet moments of reflection, feelings of longing, and the simple beauty of someone following their passion despite obstacles. She felt the music rising inside her, stronger with every note. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself feel it fully. This was not about showing off. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about expressing what had been locked inside her for years. She wanted the music to be heard, not just with ears, but with hearts. And slowly, she could see that happening. People began to react in ways she hadn't expected. Some leaned forward, resting their elbows on tables, eyes glued to her hands. Others covered their mouths, trying not to gasp or show surprise. One person whispered to another, quietly, as if sharing a secret they couldn't believe, "I didn't think she could play like this." Another shook their head slowly, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The laughter from before had completely disappeared, replaced with astonishment and respect. She continued to play, the melody now full of complexity and emotion. Her fingers danced across the keys, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always with purpose. Every chord seemed to carry a memory, a feeling, a story. She remembered the times she had been laughed at, the people who had told her she was wasting her time, the moments she had almost given up. All of it was in the music now, flowing out of her and filling the room with a sense of truth that could not be denied. A few people shifted nervously. They had expected a joke, a moment of entertainment, something to share on social media for laughs. Instead, they were forced to sit quietly and listen, fully aware of their own misjudgment. The laughter and casual smirks were gone, replaced by silence and contemplation. Some frowned, almost as if trying to solve a puzzle they didn't have the answer to. Others simply stared, unable to look away. She could feel the tension in the room, but it didn't bother her. In fact, it made her playing even stronger. The judgment, the doubt, the expectation of failure, all of it fed her focus. She played with purpose, letting every note speak for itself. Each key was like a word, each melody a sentence, and together they told a story that was impossible to ignore. The melody shifted again, becoming slower, more emotional. It carried a sense of longing and hope at the same time. People were visibly affected. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others leaned back, as if trying to take in the sound without being too obvious. The power of the music was undeniable. Even those who had doubted her from the start could not resist its pull. She glanced briefly at the audience, though she did not break her focus. She noticed faces filled with surprise, awe, and something she had rarely seen: respect. They were no longer thinking about her appearance, her clothes, or the assumptions they had made. They were thinking only about the music and the person who had brought it to life. Her hands moved faster now, creating a rich and vibrant part of the melody that demanded attention. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound. It was not just music. It was energy, emotion, and life itself. People who had been leaning back now leaned forward. Phones were forgotten. Smiles that had once been mocking were now replaced with disbelief. They were watching someone who had been underestimated and seeing her transform. The room with her talent. She felt the connection growing. It was as if the piano was speaking for her, reaching out to everyone who had doubted her, reminding them that true skill and passion cannot be ignored. Each note carried meaning, each pause gave room for thought, and each chord resonated in the hearts of those listening. She had become more than a player. She had become a storyteller, and her story was clear to all who were paying attention. Even the people who had been ready to mock her now found themselves moved. Some shook their heads slowly, as if trying to convince themselves that what they were hearing was real. Others whispered quietly, "I didn't expect this," or "She's incredible." The words were soft, but they carried the truth that they had all felt but couldn't express. Her fingers slowed, and the melody softened again, delicate and thoughtful. She allowed herself to feel the room's reaction. There was tension, yes, but also admiration. The people who had expected a joke were now witnessing something extraordinary. She didn't need applause yet. The silence itself was acknowledgement enough. As she continued to play, she thought about how easy it had been to underestimate someone based on their appearance or background. How quickly people judge without knowing the effort, the hours of practice, the dedication, or the struggles that lie beneath the surface. She had been judged countless times, and now she realized this moment was a chance to show that talent and dedication cannot be measured by first impressions. The music became more complex, moving through highs and lows, soft and loud passages, delicate moments and bold statements. Every note was filled with meaning. The room, which had once been full of laughter, chatter, and doubt, was now completely immersed in her performance. She could see the change in people's expressions. Some were leaning forward, almost holding their breath. Others had tears in their eyes. Caught off guard by the beauty and honesty of what they were hearing, she felt a surge of emotion herself. Not from fear, but from the realization that she was finally being understood. Not through words, but through music. This was a connection deeper than conversation, deeper than appearances. This was the language she had always known, the way she had always spoken her truth. Finally being heard, and as the melody continued, growing richer and more intense, she knew that something had shifted. Something had changed, not just in her, but in everyone who had doubted her. The moment of judgment had passed, replaced by awareness, understanding, and respect. She had taken a place in that room that no one expected, and through her music, she had shown who she really was. The final notes of this part lingered in the air, soft and trembling like a question waiting for an answer. She lifted her hands from the keys, breathing deeply, feeling the energy of the room settle around her. People were silent, not out of boredom, not out of impatience, but because they were fully present, fully aware of what had just happened. For the first time that day, she smiled slightly to herself. She had faced the doubt, the laughter, and the judgment, and she had not only survived it, she had transformed it into something beautiful. And though she knew there was more to come, she felt a quiet sense of pride, a recognition that she had done something remarkable, something that would stay with everyone in that room long after the music ended. She had already played for several minutes, yet she did not stop. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that felt like it was part of her very being, flowing effortlessly over the keys. The room was completely still now, though once it had been filled with laughter and doubt. Every person present was caught, spellbound by the music, unable to look away. It was no longer a piano performance. It had become a story, a confession, a bridge between her world and theirs. She felt the room's energy shift even more. The tension she had sensed earlier, the judgment and anticipation, had turned into something heavier, awe. People were leaning in without realizing, captivated by the honesty of the sound. Eyes widened in surprise, heads tilted as if trying to understand how a simple person, someone they had dismissed at first glance, could create something so breathtaking. The music carried more than melody, it carried emotion, history, and experience. She remembered every single time she had been underestimated. Every glance that said she wasn't worth noticing, every laugh at her expense, every discouraging word. Each of those moments, once painful and sharp, now fueled her. She played not out of defiance, but because every note deserved to be heard. She let the piano tell her story, the story of countless quiet nights of sacrifice, of hope that had never wavered despite constant doubt. Her hands moved faster now, executing complex passages that required precision and concentration. The audience, who had expected a joke, were now caught off guard by her skill. Some had their mouths slightly open, eyes fixed on her hands as they danced over the keys. Others sat back, taking in the full sound, unable to comprehend that someone so ordinary in appearance could command such power and grace. The piano was speaking in a language that no one could interrupt, and she was its translator. For a few moments she allowed herself a small glance at the audience. She saw disbelief in their faces. They were trying to reconcile the image they had of her with the music filling the room. One man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight, clearly struggling to understand what he had just witnessed. A woman, who had been laughing before, now had her hands folded in her lap, her expression soft and attentive. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the sound of breathing seemed hushed. She shifted to a slower section of the melody, letting the notes linger in the air, soft and thoughtful. It was a moment of reflection within the music, giving space for emotion to settle in the room. Some eyes closed. A few people leaned their heads slightly forward, as if trying to absorb the music directly into themselves. The notes were gentle but powerful, each one touching something deep within those listening. As she continued, she felt something new, connection. She realized that the room wasn't just listening, it was experiencing the same journey she had been on for years. Every hardship, every small victory, every quiet night of practice was somehow being understood without words. The audience was no longer judging her. They were learning from her. They were witnessing what perseverance and passion can create when given even a single chance. Her fingers moved nimbly over the keys, navigating through the highs and lows of the piece. The music grew bolder, louder, commanding attention with a confidence that matched her own. Each chord was intentional, precise, full of emotion. She felt the strength of her own story pushing through, turning into sound waves that filled every corner of the room. It was no longer simply a performance. It had become a lesson in resilience, humility, and the power of talent. The people who had once whispered and snickered now found themselves completely silent. Some tilted their heads, trying to understand what had just happened. Others stared with wide eyes, slowly realizing that they had misjudged her from the very beginning. A few even shifted nervously, as if suddenly aware of their own assumptions and biases. The laughter that had once been so natural had vanished completely. Respect had replaced it. The melody became richer, layered with subtle changes in tempo and tone. She allowed herself to feel every note, every chord, letting the music flow naturally. Her body relaxed into the rhythm, no longer tense with nerves or fear. It was as if the piano had become an extension of herself, translating her thoughts and emotions into a language everyone could understand. A woman in the back, who had been whispering to someone moments ago, was now leaning forward, fully absorbed. Her eyes glistened as she listened, realizing that the woman playing the piano was not only skilled, but deeply expressive. Each note seemed to carry a message of hope and strength. Another person, a man who had been smirking at the start, now shook his head slowly, clearly struggling to comprehend the level of talent in front of him. She felt the energy of the room building as she moved through the more dynamic part of the piece. Fast, intricate passages filled the space, echoing with precision and emotion. People were captivated, their previous judgments completely erased. Some unconsciously mimicked her rhythm with their fingers or feet. Others simply sat still, absorbing every sound as if it were a revelation. The music began to slow again, softer and more reflective. She allowed herself a brief moment to think about how far she had come. Every time she had been doubted, laughed at, or ignored had prepared her for this moment. Every hour of practice, every sacrifice, every silent struggle had led to this instant where she could prove, not just to the world but to herself, that her talent and determination mattered, even in the soft, quiet moments. The power of her music was evident. The audience was completely engaged, feeling the depth of emotion behind each note. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were frozen, unable to move as they listened. The room, once full of casual chatter and laughter, was now transformed into a space of respect and admiration. She continued to play, transitioning to the final section of the piece. Her fingers moved with grace, each note deliberate, each chord resonant. She could feel the story reaching its climax, and she poured everything she had into it, her struggles, her hopes, her dreams, and her unspoken words. The music told what words could not. The audience was completely captivated. The ones who had laughed were now silent, leaning forward, trying to absorb every moment. Their expressions had changed from amusement to disbelief, to awe to respect. They had expected a joke, but instead, they had received an experience, a glimpse into the soul of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. When the final notes hung in the air, soft and trembling, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys. The room remained quiet, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with emotion, reflection, and a shared understanding of what had just occurred. The people who had doubted her were no longer laughing. They were thoughtful, moved, and transformed by her performance. She exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet joy. She had faced the judgment, the doubt, and the mockery, and she had turned it all into something extraordinary. She had reminded herself of her worth, and in doing so had reminded everyone in that room as well. For a moment she allowed herself a small smile, a recognition of the power of persistence and the beauty of being true to oneself. The energy in the room shifted again as people began to process what they had just experienced. Some whispered softly to one another, expressing disbelief and admiration. Others simply sat quietly, letting the music linger in their minds. She didn't need to speak. Her story had been told. The piano had spoken for her, and everyone in the room had listened. In that moment, she realized something profound. True talent, combined with dedication and courage, can overcome even the harshest judgment. People may laugh, doubt, or underestimate. But when given the chance, a person who believes in themselves can transform doubt into awe, laughter into respect, and judgment into admiration. And as she sat there, letting the final echoes of her music fade, she understood that this moment was bigger than herself. It was a reminder to everyone present that appearances can be deceiving, that talent often hides in unexpected places, and that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not what others assume. She sat quietly for a moment, letting the final echoes of her music fade into the stillness of the room. Her hands hovered just above the keys before resting in her lap. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the weight of what had just happened. The room was silent, but it was a silence heavy with emotion. The laughter and whispers that had greeted her when she first walked in were completely gone, replaced by a quiet reverence. The people who had doubted her looked around at one another, unsure of how to respond. Their expressions were a mixture of astonishment, respect, and something deeper realization. They had expected a joke, a fleeting moment of amusement, and instead they had been witness to something far more profound. Some were still staring at the piano, as if they couldn't believe someone could produce such beauty from its keys. Others avoided looking directly at her, perhaps because they felt a little guilty for ever having underestimated her. She lowered her gaze. Not because she was embarrassed, but because she had learned to stay humble. She didn't need applause or praise to validate her talent. The music itself had done that. Each note had carried a piece of her story, a story of struggle, perseverance, and quiet determination. And now, for the first time in a very long time, she felt that people were truly seeing her, not just her appearance. Not just the simplicity of her clothes, but her spirit, her dedication, her resilience. A few moments passed before someone in the room finally spoke. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but the weight of it carried through the still air. "That was incredible," the person said. The words were simple, but they held sincerity. Slowly, others began to murmur in agreement. "I've never heard anything like that. How long have you been playing?" Each comment was tinged with awe and surprise, the kind of admiration that only comes when someone's expectations are completely overturned. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the moment to linger. Every face in the room told a story of realization, of the moment they understood that talent cannot be judged by appearance, status, or first impressions. They had laughed at her. They had expected her to fail. And yet here she was, standing in her own quiet victory, not because she had wanted to prove them wrong, but because she had stayed true to herself, finally. She spoke softly, her voice calm but confident. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad you listened." There was no pride in her tone, no bitterness toward the people who had doubted her. Only honesty. Only gratitude for the chance to share what had been inside her for so long. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of her experience and the humility of someone who had worked hard in silence for many years. The room seemed to shift again. People began to approach her, slowly at first, hesitant to break the spell, yet drawn by admiration and curiosity. One person reached out to shake her hand. Another nodded with a quiet smile. It was a subtle but powerful acknowledgement of her talent, a recognition of her courage to step into a space where she was not expected or wanted, and still make her voice heard. She allowed herself a small, private smile. This was what she had wanted, not to humiliate anyone, not to be seen as superior, but simply to be recognized for who she truly was. Every note she had played had been a bridge between her life and theirs, a connection that had gone beyond words. And now that connection remained, even as the music had ended. Lingering in the hearts of everyone present, a few people lingered near the piano, as if hoping to hear more, to catch even a single additional note. Others took a step back, still absorbing the experience. The energy in the room had transformed. What had begun as mockery and doubt had become respect, curiosity, and even inspiration. Some faces showed tears, subtle and quiet, because they had been unexpectedly moved. Others simply stared in awe of someone they had underestimated. Realizing that they had witnessed something rare and beautiful, she looked around at the room, taking in the expressions of those who had once laughed. There was a softness there now, a humility that comes when people recognize the depth of another's talent and the courage it takes to show it. They had been taught an unspoken lesson, that assumptions can be misleading, that appearances are not reliable indicators of skill or character, and that everyone deserves a chance to be heard and seen for who they truly are. For her, the moment was transformative too. She had faced doubt and judgment head-on and had emerged not just unscathed but elevated. She had turned fear and uncertainty into a performance that revealed her talent, her passion, and her inner strength. And in doing so, she had not only proven something to the people in the room but reminded herself of her own resilience and worth. Slowly, people began to leave the immediate space around the piano, some still whispering among themselves, others carrying the weight of the experience in thoughtful silence. She remained seated for a moment longer, hands folded in her lap, savoring the quiet aftermath. This had been more than a performance. It had been a revelation for herself and for everyone who had doubted her. The piano, still glowing under the light, seemed to hum quietly with the memory of the music that had just filled the room. She reached out, gently running her fingers over the keys one last time, feeling the smooth surface beneath her touch. Each note, each chord, had carried a piece of her story, and now it lingered in the room as a silent testimony to the power of dedication, courage, and belief in oneself. As she rose from the bench, she felt a sense of calm and quiet pride. The people who had once laughed were no longer laughing. They had been changed by her music, forced to see beyond their initial assumptions. And she had been reminded that sometimes all it takes is a single act of courage, a single moment of truth, to change the way people see you, and perhaps even the way they see themselves. She left the piano behind, but the memory of the moment stayed with everyone present. The people who had mocked her, even if only in their minds, had been given a glimpse of something extraordinary. They had witnessed a quiet strength, a hidden talent, and a human story told through music. They had learned that greatness often comes from unexpected places, and that judging someone too quickly can mean missing out on something truly remarkable. Walking away from the room, she carried with her a sense of fulfillment and peace. She had played not for fame, not for recognition, but because it was a part of who she was. And in doing so, she had left a lasting impression on the people who had once doubted her. They would remember this moment, the unexpected talent, the quiet courage, the beautiful music, for a long time to come. She understood now that moments like these don't happen often, and when they do, they leave a mark not just on the audience, but on the performer as well. She had faced judgment, laughter, and doubt, and she had emerged with her dignity intact, her talent recognized, and her spirit lifted. And perhaps, most importantly, she had reminded everyone present that the true measure of a person is not in how they look or what others expect of them, but in their passion, persistence, and willingness to share their gift with the world. For the first time that day, she felt completely seen, not just as someone who could play the piano, but as a person who had faced challenges, overcome fear, and remained true to herself. The applause, when it finally came, was soft but sincere, and it was enough. She smiled, not because she needed validation, but because she had finally experienced the quiet joy of being recognized for who she truly was. And as she stepped away from the piano and left the room behind, she carried with her a sense of triumph and gratitude. She had turned doubt into admiration, laughter into respect, and an ordinary moment into something extraordinary. The story of that day, of the music that had filled the room, would remain with everyone who had been there and for her. It was a reminder that the courage to be yourself, to share your passion despite the odds, can change not just your life, but the lives of those around you.